A desperate widow arrives at a remote ranch with a dying baby. The gruff cook who saves her child carries secrets that will change everything she thought she knew about love, loss, and second chances in the unforgiving frontier. The baby's breathing was so shallow that Sarah Whitman had to press her ear against his tiny chest just to hear the flutter of life still fighting inside him. 3 days of fever, 3 days of that terrible rattling cough, and now little Thomas felt like nothing but skin stretched over bird bones. The wagon jolted over another rut, and Sarah bit back a sob as her son's head lolled against her shoulder. She'd lost her husband to consumption 6 months ago, and now the same disease was trying to claim their baby. The irony wasn't lost on her. She'd come west to start fresh, to escape the ghosts that haunted every corner of their old life in Missouri, only to find that death followed wherever hope tried to take root. The Circle M Ranch appeared through the heat shimmer like a mirage that refused to disappear. Sarah had heard about it in Dry Creek, the last town she'd passed through before her horse went lame and left her stranded with a wagon, a dying baby, and nowhere else to go. The ranch hands had mentioned a cook, gruff as a bear, they'd said, but decent enough if you caught him in the right mood. Sarah didn't care about his mood. All she cared about was the thin whistle of breath still escaping Thomas's lips, and the desperate hope that someone, anyone, might know how to help. She pulled the wagon up to the main house and climbed down on shaking legs, Thomas bundled in her arms like a precious, fragile bundle of sorrow. The ranch was bigger than she'd expected, sprawling and well-kept, with corrals full of horses and the kind of organized chaos that spoke of prosperity. But it was the smell coming from the cookhouse that stopped her in her tracks, something rich and savory that made her empty stomach clench with sudden hunger. When had she last eaten? Yesterday, the day before. Time had blurred into one endless cycle of worry and prayer. "Help," she called out, her voice cracking from thirst and exhaustion. "Please, someone help me." The words felt inadequate, too small to carry the weight of her desperation, but they were all she had left. Thomas stirred in her arms, and for one heart-stopping moment, she thought he'd stopped breathing entirely. Then his tiny chest rose again, barely visible beneath the worn blanket she'd wrapped him in. A man emerged from the cookhouse, wiping his hands on a stained apron. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with dark hair streaked with premature silver and eyes the color of storm clouds. There was something about the way he moved, careful, deliberate, like a man who'd learned to be gentle through hard experience. Sarah found herself staring at his hands as he approached. They were scarred and weathered from years of hard work, but they moved with surprising grace as he reached toward her. "Ma'am," his voice was rough around the edges, like whiskey left too long in the sun, but there was kindness in it that made Sarah's knees nearly buckle with relief. "What's wrong?" "My baby," she whispered, lifting Thomas toward him with trembling arms. "He's sick, so sick, I don't know what else to do." The words tumbled out in a rush, fear making her voice sharp and desperate. "Please, I'll work for you, I'll do anything, just help him." The cook, she realized she didn't even know his name, took Thomas from her arms with the kind of practiced ease that spoke of experience with fragile things. Sarah watched his face change as he felt the baby's weight, saw the fever flush on those tiny cheeks, heard the labored breathing that had haunted her dreams for days. His expression grew grim, but not hopeless, and that small distinction felt like the first good news she'd had in months. "Name's Cole Brennan," he said quietly, already turning toward the cookhouse. "And this little one's burning up with fever. Come on, we need to get him cooled down and get some medicine in him before." He didn't finish the sentence, but Sarah heard the unspoken words anyway. "Before it's too late." The thought sent ice through her veins despite the desert heat. She followed Cole into the cookhouse, and was immediately enveloped by warmth and the comforting smell of bread and herbs. The space was larger than she'd expected, with a massive stone hearth, shelves lined with jars and bottles, and a long wooden table scarred from years of use. But it was clean, cleaner than most kitchens she'd seen, and there was an order to everything that spoke of a man who took pride in his work. Cole moved through the space like he owned it, which maybe he did, in all the ways that mattered. "Sarah Whitman," she said belatedly, realizing she hadn't given her name. "And this is Thomas." Her voice caught on her son's name, and she had to swallow hard to keep from breaking down completely. She'd been strong for so long, carrying the weight of grief and responsibility and fear all by herself. But something about Cole's quiet competence made her want to collapse and let someone else take care of things for once. Cole was already at work, laying Thomas on a clean cloth spread across the table and unwrapping the bundle of blankets with gentle, practiced hands. The baby looked even smaller under the bright light streaming through the windows, his skin pale and waxy except for the fever spots burning high on his cheeks. Sarah bit her lip hard enough to taste blood as she watched Cole examine her son, checking his breathing, feeling for his pulse, looking into eyes that seemed too large for his tiny face. "How long has he been like this?" Cole asked, not looking up from Thomas but continuing his careful examination. His hands moved with surprising delicacy as he felt along the baby's neck and chest, checking for swelling or other signs of illness. Sarah found herself watching those hands again, wondering where a ranch cook had learned to handle a sick child with such gentle expertise. 3 days, Sarah said, wrapping her arms around herself to stop the trembling that had nothing to do with cold. "Maybe 4. It started as just a little cough, but then the fever came and he stopped eating, and I thought maybe if I could get him to a doctor." Her voice broke completely then, and she had to turn away to compose herself. She'd been so certain she could handle anything, that she was strong enough to build a new life for herself and Thomas. But watching her baby suffer while she stood helplessly had shattered that confidence into 1,000 sharp pieces. Cole looked up at her then, and Sarah was startled by the depth of understanding in his eyes. It wasn't pity. She'd seen enough pity to last a lifetime, but something deeper. Recognition, maybe, of the kind of loss that carved permanent shadows under a person's eyes. "You did right bringing him here," he said firmly, and Sarah felt something tight in her chest loosen just a fraction. "This isn't your fault, and we're going to fix it." The certainty in his voice was like a lifeline thrown to a drowning woman. Sarah grabbed onto it with both hands, allowing herself to hope for the first time in days that maybe, just maybe, Thomas would be all right. She watched as Cole moved to his shelves, selecting jars and bottles with the confidence of a man who knew exactly what he was doing. Where most people saw a cook, Sarah was beginning to suspect there was much more to Cole Brennan than met the eye. Cole's hands moved with the precision of a surgeon as he mixed powders and liquids in a small tin cup, measuring everything by sight and instinct rather than careful measurement. Sarah watched him work, mesmerized by the quiet confidence in every movement. This wasn't the fumbling of a ranch hand trying to remember folk remedies passed down from his grandmother. This was knowledge, real knowledge, the kind that came from training and experience and maybe heartbreak. "What is that?" Sarah asked, stepping closer as Cole stirred the mixture until it became a pale, cloudy liquid. The smell was sharp and medicinal, nothing like the home remedies she'd tried in desperation over the past few days. Thomas lay still on the table, his breathing so shallow she had to keep checking to make sure his tiny chest was still rising and falling. "Willow bark extract, honey to make it palatable, and a few other things," Cole said, not looking up from his work. "It'll bring the fever down and ease the inflammation in his lungs." He paused, glancing at Sarah with those storm-gray eyes. "You ever given a baby medicine before?" Sarah shook her head, feeling helpless and useless all over again. "I tried everything I knew, but nothing worked. He just kept getting worse." The admission felt like failure, like she'd somehow let Thomas down by not knowing how to save him. What kind of mother was she if she couldn't even keep her own child alive? Cole must have seen something in her expression because his voice gentled. "You got him here, that's what matters now." He lifted the cup and moved back to the table where Thomas lay. "I need you to hold his head steady while I give him this. Just a few drops at a time. We don't want him to choke." Sarah positioned herself at Thomas's head, cradling his fevered skull in her palms. His skin was burning hot, and she could feel the rapid flutter of his pulse beneath her fingertips. Cole sat beside her, close enough that she could smell the scent of wood smoke and herbs that clung to his clothes. When he leaned over Thomas, Sarah noticed a thin scar that ran from his left ear down to his jaw, barely visible beneath his beard. Another mystery to add to the growing list. "Easy now, little man," Cole murmured as he carefully dripped the medicine onto Thomas's tongue. His voice was different when he spoke to the baby, softer, with a tenderness that made Sarah's heart do something strange and fluttery. "I know it tastes terrible, but it's going to help you feel better." Thomas stirred weakly, his tiny mouth working as he swallowed the medicine. Most of it went down, which Cole seemed to take as a good sign. "Where did you learn to do this?" Sarah asked quietly, unable to keep the curiosity out of her voice any longer. "I mean, you're the ranch cook, but you handle medicine like you've had training." Cole's hand stilled for just a moment, and Sarah caught a flicker of something, pain, regret, in his eyes before he continued administering the medicine. "Picked up a few things over the years," he said finally, his tone carefully neutral. "You learn what you need to learn out here." It wasn't really an answer, and they both knew it. But before Sarah could press further, Thomas made a small sound, not quite a cry, but the first sound he'd made in hours that didn't sound like he was dying. Cole's face lit up with the first real smile Sarah had seen from him, and the transformation was remarkable. The stern lines around his eyes softened, and for a moment he looked years younger. "That's a good sign," Cole said, setting the empty cup aside. "The medicine's already starting to work. Now we need to get his fever down." He moved to the hearth and pulled a kettle from the coals, testing the water temperature with his finger. "Sarah, I need you to undress him down to his diaper. We're going to give him a lukewarm bath." Sarah's hands shook as she unwrapped Thomas from his blankets and carefully removed his tiny shirt. He was so thin, she realized with a stab of guilt. When had he gotten so thin? The past few days had been such a blur of worry and travel that she hadn't really looked at him, really seen how much the illness had taken out of his small body. His ribs showed clearly under his pale skin, and his arms and legs looked like twigs. Cole returned with a large ceramic bowl filled with tepid water, and together they lowered Thomas into it. The baby gasped at first, his back arching in protest, but as the cool water began to draw the heat from his fevered skin, he relaxed. Sarah kept one hand supporting his head while Cole gently poured water over his chest and arms with a soft cloth. "He's beautiful," Cole said quietly, and Sarah looked up to find him studying Thomas with an expression she couldn't quite read. There was admiration there, but also something that looked almost like longing. "How old is he?" "4 months," Sarah replied, her voice thick with emotion. "He was born just 2 weeks before my husband died." The words came out more easily than she'd expected. Maybe it was the relief of seeing Thomas respond to the treatment, or maybe it was something about Cole's calm presence that made her want to share the burden she'd been carrying alone for so long. Cole's hands gentled even further as he continued bathing Thomas. "Consumption." Sarah nodded, not trusting her voice. David had fought the disease for months, growing thinner and weaker while she tried to care for both him and their newborn son. By the end, she'd been so exhausted she could barely think straight. When David finally passed, she'd felt guilty for the relief mixed in with her grief. At least the watching and waiting and hoping against hope was finally over. "My wife died of consumption," Cole said quietly, so quietly that Sarah almost missed it over the gentle splashing of water. "Along with our daughter, 3 years ago this winter." The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. She looked up at Cole's face and saw the carefully controlled grief there, the kind of pain that never really healed but learned to hide itself behind competent hands and helpful actions. Suddenly, his expertise with sick children made perfect sense, as did the longing in his eyes when he looked at Thomas. "I'm sorry," Sarah whispered, because what else was there to say? She knew the inadequacy of those words, had heard them herself countless times over the past 6 months. But Cole nodded as if he understood exactly what she meant and what she couldn't say. "Hannah was about Thomas's age when the fever took her," Cole continued, his voice steady but distant. "I tried everything I knew, every remedy, every medicine I could get my hands on. Nothing worked." He paused, his hands stilling in the water. That's when I started learning everything I could about treating illnesses, especially in children. Figured if I couldn't save my own daughter, maybe I could save someone else's. Sarah felt tears burning behind her eyes, but for the first time in months, they weren't tears of despair. Here was a man who had taken his deepest loss and turned it into something that could help others. Here was a man who understood exactly what she was going through because he'd walked the same terrible path. And here was a man who was using that hard-won knowledge to save her son. Thomas stirred in the water, and both adults turned their attention back to him. His breathing seemed easier already, and the angry flush was beginning to fade from his cheeks. Cole lifted him from the bath and wrapped him in a clean, soft towel, holding him with the kind of natural ease that spoke of experience with babies. "The fever's breaking," Cole said, and the relief in his voice matched what Sarah was feeling. "He's going to be all right, Sarah. It'll take a few days for him to get his strength back, but he's going to be all right." Sarah collapsed into a nearby chair, her legs suddenly unable to support her weight. The fear and tension she'd been carrying for days seemed to drain out of her all at once, leaving her feeling hollow and shaky but grateful beyond words. "Thank you," she whispered, the words completely inadequate for what Cole had done. "Thank you so much." Cole was busy dressing Thomas in a clean shirt he'd produced from somewhere, his movements gentle and practiced. "You don't need to thank me," he said. "This is what people should do for each other." He finished with the baby's clothes and handed him back to Sarah, who clutched him against her chest and finally allowed herself to believe that her son was going to live. But as Thomas settled against her, making small, healthy sounds of contentment, Sarah found herself studying Cole's face and wondering what other secrets lay behind those storm-gray eyes. A man didn't learn to care for sick children just from watching one die. A man didn't move with that kind of medical precision just from reading books. And a man certainly didn't end up cooking for a ranch in the middle of nowhere without a story worth telling. "Cole," she began, but he was already moving away, busying himself with cleaning up the medicine bottles and putting things back in their proper places. The moment of openness had passed, and the walls were going back up. But Sarah had seen enough to know that there was much more to Cole Brennan than he wanted anyone to discover. The question was whether he'd ever trust her enough to let her see the rest of the truth. Thomas slept peacefully in Sarah's arms for the first time in days, his breathing steady and his fever completely broken. Sarah found herself dozing in the chair Cole had pulled close to the fire, finally able to rest now that the immediate crisis had passed. She woke to the sound of voices outside and the smell of something delicious cooking on the stove. For a moment, she forgot where she was, lost in that peaceful space between sleep and waking where problems seemed distant and manageable. Then she heard Cole's voice, low and tense, speaking to someone just outside the cookhouse door. "She's not going anywhere, Garrett. The baby was dying and she had nowhere else to go." There was an edge to his tone that Sarah hadn't heard before, something protective and dangerous that made her sit up straighter in the chair. "I don't care if she was dying herself," came the reply in a voice that was younger but carried the unmistakable authority of someone used to being obeyed. "This is a working ranch, not a charity house for every sob story that comes wandering in from the desert. We've got a business to run." Sarah's cheeks burned with embarrassment and anger. She'd known this moment would come eventually, the moment when reality intruded and she'd have to face the fact that she had no money, no place to go, and no right to expect charity from strangers. But hearing herself described as a sob story stung more than she'd expected. She'd been someone once, a wife and mother with a home and a future. Now she was just another desperate woman with a baby, dependent on the kindness of people who had every right to turn her away. "The woman's name is Sarah Whitman, and she's been through hell," Cole said, his voice dropping even lower. "Show a little respect or keep your mouth shut." The words were spoken quietly, but there was steel beneath them that made Sarah's pulse quicken. She'd never had anyone defend her with such quiet ferocity, not even David, who'd been gentle and kind but never particularly strong when it came to confrontation. Don't tell me how to run my ranch, Cole, the other man, Garrett, shot back. I know you feel sorry for every stray that wanders onto the property, but we can't afford to. Your ranch, Cole's voice went dangerously soft. Last I checked, your father still owned the Circle M, and last I checked, he had the final say about who stays and who goes. There was a long pause, and Sarah found herself holding her breath as she waited to see how this confrontation would play out. Thomas stirred in her arms, making small contented sounds that seemed impossibly loud in the sudden silence. She should probably make her presence known, should step outside and face whatever judgment was waiting for her. But something kept her frozen in place, desperate to hear how this conversation would end. Fine, Garrett said finally, but his voice was tight with barely controlled anger. But when the old man asks why we're running a boarding house instead of a ranch, I'm going to tell him it was your idea. Heavy footsteps moved away across the yard, accompanied by the jingle of spurs and muttered curses that Sarah was probably better off not hearing clearly. Cole was quiet for a long moment after Garrett left, and Sarah could picture him standing there in the doorway, probably running his hands through his hair the way men did when they were frustrated. When he finally came back inside, his expression was carefully neutral, but Sarah could see the tension in his shoulders and the way his jaw was set. I'm sorry you had to hear that, he said without looking directly at her. Garrett's young and thinks he knows how to run things better than anyone else. Don't pay him any mind. Sarah shifted Thomas to one arm and struggled to her feet, her body stiff from sleeping in the chair. He's right, though, she said quietly. This is a working ranch and I have no business being here. I should go. Go where? Cole asked, finally meeting her eyes. You said yourself you have nowhere else to go. Your horse is lame, your wagon's falling apart, and you don't have enough supplies to make it to the next town. He moved to the stove and stirred whatever was cooking there, the domestic gesture somehow at odds with the protective edge she'd heard in his voice just moments before. I'll figure something out, Sarah said, though even as she spoke the words, she knew how hollow they sounded. She had $17 sewn into the lining of her coat, a broken wagon, and a 4-month-old baby who just recovered from a serious illness. Her options were limited at best and non-existent at worst. Cole turned to face her fully, and Sarah was startled by the intensity in his gray eyes. You know what I think? I think you've been figuring things out by yourself for too long. I think you've been carrying the weight of the world on your shoulders since your husband died, and you're so used to handling everything alone that you don't know how to accept help when it's offered. The words hit closer to home than Sarah wanted to admit. She had been handling everything alone, and it had nearly broken her. The thought of continuing to struggle on her own felt overwhelming, but the thought of accepting charity felt almost worse. She'd been raised to be independent, to pull her own weight, to never be a burden on anyone. The idea of staying here without being able to contribute anything meaningful went against everything she'd been taught about how decent people lived their lives. I won't be a charity case, she said, lifting her chin with as much dignity as she could muster. If I stay, I need to work. I need to earn my keep. Something that might have been admiration flickered in Cole's eyes. What kind of work can you do? I can cook, Sarah said immediately, then felt her cheeks burn as she realized how that sounded. I mean, I know you're the cook here, but I could help with the washing or the mending or... You can cook, Cole interrupted, and there was something odd in his tone that made Sarah study his face more carefully. How well can you cook? Sarah frowned, unsure where this was leading. Well enough, I suppose. I fed my family for 6 years and no one ever complained. I can make bread and stew and roasts and pies. She paused, then added with a touch of pride, my apple pie won the county fair 3 years running. Cole was quiet for a long moment, and Sarah could almost see the wheels turning in his head. When he finally spoke, his words were careful and measured. The thing is, Sarah, I'm not really the ranch cook. Sarah blinked, certain she'd misheard him. What do you mean? You've been cooking, you made medicine for Thomas. This is the cookhouse. I am cooking, Cole agreed. But only because the real cook-up and quit 2 weeks ago without any notice. Left us in a real bind, especially with the spring roundup starting and 30 hungry ranch hands expecting 3 hot meals a day. He ran a hand through his hair, and Sarah noticed for the first time how tired he looked. I've been doing my best, but cooking for that many men isn't exactly my area of expertise. Sarah stared at him, trying to process this information. Then what is your area of expertise? I mean, if you're not the cook, what do you actually do here? Cole hesitated, and Sarah could see him weighing how much to tell her. I'm the ranch foreman, he said finally. Have been for the past 3 years. But when Charlie quit, someone had to step in and keep the men fed, and I was the only one with any kitchen experience at all. The pieces began falling into place in Sarah's mind. The way Garrett had spoken to him with grudging respect despite his obvious anger. The easy authority in Cole's voice when he defended her. The fact that he lived in the cookhouse, which was larger and better appointed than she'd expected for a simple ranch cook. Cole wasn't just a hired hand with medical knowledge. He was the man who ran this entire operation. You're the foreman, Sarah repeated slowly, which means you have the authority to hire people. Within reason, Cole said cautiously. Why? Sarah felt something that might have been hope stirring in her chest for the first time in months. Because I need work and you need a cook. It seems like we might be able to help each other. Cole studied her face for a long moment, and Sarah got the distinct impression he was seeing far more than she intended to show. Cooking for 30 ranch hands is a lot different from cooking for a family, he said finally. It's hard work, long hours, and the men can be demanding. I'm not afraid of hard work, Sarah said, and she meant it. Hard work would be a blessing after the helpless desperation of the past few months. Hard work would give her purpose and dignity and a way to provide for Thomas without depending on anyone's charity. And I'm not afraid of demanding men. I grew up with 3 brothers. A smile tugged at the corners of Cole's mouth. 3 brothers, huh? That might actually prepare you for dealing with ranch hands. He was quiet for another moment, then nodded slowly. All right, Sarah Whitman, you've got yourself a job, but I have conditions. Sarah's heart leaped, but she kept her expression carefully neutral. What kind of conditions? First, you and Thomas stay in the cookhouse. It's got a small room in the back that should work fine for the 2 of you, and it makes sense for the cook to live where she works. Cole's tone was businesslike, but Sarah caught the underlying kindness in the arrangement. Second, you take your orders from me, not from Garrett or anyone else. The kitchen is your domain, but I'm still the foreman. And third, Sarah asked, sensing there was more. Third, if Thomas gets sick again, or if you need help with anything at all, you come to me. No trying to handle everything on your own. Cole's expression grew serious. I meant what I said about you carrying too much by yourself. That stops now. Sarah felt tears prick her eyes, but these were good tears, the kind that came with relief and gratitude and the first real hope she'd felt in longer than she could remember. I accept your conditions, she said softly. All of them. Cole nodded once, then moved back to the stove. Good. In that case, you can start by helping me figure out what to do with this stew. I think I may have added too much salt. Sarah laughed, surprising herself with the sound. When was the last time she'd laughed? She couldn't even remember. But as she moved to join Cole at the stove, Thomas still sleeping peacefully in her arms, she felt something she hadn't felt since David died. She felt like she belonged somewhere again. Sarah's first morning as the Circle M cook began before dawn with the sound of boots on the cookhouse porch and voices calling for coffee. She'd barely slept, partly from Thomas waking twice for feeding and partly from nerves about proving herself worthy of Cole's faith in her. But as she tied her apron and surveyed the kitchen that was now her responsibility, she felt more alive than she had in months. This was work she understood, work that mattered, work that would let her hold her head high. Cole appeared in the doorway just as she was pulling the first batch of biscuits from the oven, his hair still damp from washing and his shirt only half buttoned. He stopped short when he saw her, something unreadable flickering across his face as he took in the sight of her moving confidently around his kitchen. Sarah felt heat rise in her cheeks and quickly turned back to the stove, reminding herself that she was here to work, nothing more. "You're up early," Cole said, his voice still rough with sleep. "The men don't usually expect breakfast for another hour." "I wanted to get a feel for everything," Sarah replied, stirring the massive pot of oatmeal she'd started cooking. "Besides, Thomas was awake, so I figured I might as well be productive." She nodded toward the corner where Thomas lay in a makeshift cradle Cole had fashioned from a wooden crate and soft blankets. The baby was wide awake, making happy gurgling sounds and waving his tiny fists at the shadows dancing on the ceiling. Cole moved to the coffee pot and poured himself a cup, but Sarah noticed he kept glancing at Thomas with that same expression of longing she'd seen yesterday. "He looks better," Cole said quietly. "Color's good, breathing's clear." "Thanks to you," Sarah said and meant it. Without Cole's quick thinking and medical knowledge, she would have lost Thomas, and the thought still made her stomach clench with remembered terror. "I owe you more than I can ever repay." "You don't owe me anything," Cole said firmly. "But if you want to thank me, you can tell me what you put in these biscuits. They smell better than anything I've managed to produce in the past 2 weeks." Sarah smiled, feeling some of her nervous tension ease. "Buttermilk and a touch of honey, my mother's recipe." She pulled another pan from the oven and began transferring the golden biscuits to a large basket. She always said the secret to good biscuits was treating the dough like you loved it but weren't afraid to let it go. Cole took a bite of one of the biscuits and made a sound that was almost a groan. "The men are going to think they've died and gone to heaven," he said around the mouthful. "Charlie's biscuits could have been used as ammunition." "Speaking of the men," Sarah said, her confidence faltering slightly, "what should I expect? I mean, what are they like?" Cole considered the question while he finished his biscuit. "They're good men mostly, work hard, don't cause too much trouble, but they've been eating my cooking for 2 weeks, so they're probably a little grumpy about meal times." He paused, studying her face. "They might test you at first, see if they can rattle you or get you to give them special treatment. Don't let them." Before Sarah could ask what he meant by that, the cookhouse door burst open, and a stream of ranch hands began filing in, their voices loud, and their movements still heavy with sleep. Sarah felt her heart rate spike as she suddenly found herself face to face with 30 hungry men who were all staring at her with varying degrees of curiosity and skepticism. "Well, well," said a tall, lanky cowboy with a scraggly beard and eyes that held more mischief than malice. "Looks like Cole finally found us a real cook, and a pretty one too." The comment earned him several chuckles and elbow jabs from his companions, but Sarah noticed that Cole's expression darkened considerably. "This is Sarah Whitman," Cole said, his voice carrying the unmistakable tone of authority. "She's your new cook, and you'll treat her with the same respect you'd show your own mother's. Anyone who has a problem with that can take it up with me." The threat in his words was quiet but unmistakable, and Sarah felt a flutter of something warm and protective in her chest. "Aw, Cole, we're just being friendly," the lanky cowboy protested, but he touched his hat respectfully when he looked at Sarah. "Name's Jake Morrison, ma'am. Welcome to the Circle M." The introductions continued as the men filled their plates with oatmeal, biscuits, and thick slabs of bacon Sarah had fried to crispy perfection. She watched their faces carefully as they took their first bites, relief flooding through her when she saw expressions of genuine appreciation and surprise. Whatever they'd been expecting from the new cook, she was clearly exceeding it. "Ma'am," said an older cowboy with graying temples and gentle eyes, "I don't mean to be forward, but this is the best breakfast I've had since my Martha passed 5 years ago. Thank you." Sarah felt tears prick her eyes at the simple kindness in his words. "Thank you, Mr. Ben Fletcher," he said with a shy smile. "And it's just Ben. We don't stand much on ceremony around here." As the men ate and gradually warmed up to her presence, Sarah began to relax into the rhythm of serving and clearing and keeping the coffee flowing. This was familiar territory, the dance of feeding people and making sure everyone had what they needed. She'd been doing it for her family for years, and the skills translated easily to a larger scale. But just as she was starting to feel confident, Garrett walked through the door, and the easy atmosphere in the room shifted immediately. The men didn't exactly grow silent, but their conversations became more subdued, and Sarah noticed several of them shooting wary glances between Garrett and Cole. "Well, well," Garrett said, his tone falsely jovial as he surveyed the scene. "I see our temporary guest has made herself at home." He moved to the coffee pot and poured himself a cup, but his eyes never left Sarah's face. "Tell me, Mrs. Whitman, how long exactly are you planning to impose on our hospitality?" Sarah felt heat rise in her cheeks, but before she could respond, Cole stepped between them. "Sarah's not a guest, Garrett. She's the new cook. I hired her yesterday." Garrett's eyebrows shot up in mock surprise. "Did you now? How interesting. I wasn't aware we were hiring anyone, especially not someone who showed up here with nothing but a sick baby and a sob story." The words hit Sarah like a slap, and she saw red creep into her vision. She'd spent months being treated like a burden, like someone to be pitied or dismissed, and she was finished with it. "My name is Mrs. Sarah Whitman," she said, her voice deadly quiet but carrying clearly through the room. "I've been cooking since I was 12 years old. I've never served a bad meal in my life, and I don't need anyone's pity. I need work and you need a cook. It's a business arrangement, nothing more." The room had gone completely silent now, every man watching the confrontation with the fascination of spectators at a prize fight. Garrett's face had flushed red, and Sarah could see him struggling to maintain his composure in front of the ranch hands. "A business arrangement," Garrett repeated slowly. "And what exactly makes you think you're qualified to cook for 30 working men?" Sarah met his gaze steadily, refusing to be intimidated. "Ask them," she said simply, nodding toward the men who were still holding plates of her food. "Ask them if they think I'm qualified." Garrett looked around the room, and Sarah held her breath as she waited to see if the men would support her, or if they'd stay silent to avoid conflict with the boss's son. It was Jake Morrison who spoke first, his voice casual but firm. "Best biscuits I've had in years," he said, taking another bite for emphasis. "And the bacon's cooked just right, not burned like." He stopped himself before finishing the comparison, but everyone knew he'd been about to criticize Cole's cooking. "Coffee's perfect too," added Ben Fletcher. "Not too strong, not too weak." One by one, the other men voiced their approval, and Sarah felt a surge of gratitude toward these rough, hard-working cowboys who had chosen to stand up for her when they didn't have to. Garrett's face grew redder with each compliment, and Sarah could see that he was trapped between his obvious desire to assert his authority and the practical reality that she was clearly good at her job. "Fine," Garrett said finally, his voice tight with barely controlled anger. "But don't think this means you can take advantage of our generosity. You'll work for your keep, just like everyone else. And if you can't handle the job—" "She can handle it," Cole interrupted, his voice leaving no room for argument. "And if you have any complaints about her work, you can bring them to me." Garrett turned that cold stare on Cole, and Sarah suddenly realized she was witnessing something bigger than just a disagreement about hiring decisions. There was real animosity here, old grievances and power struggles that had nothing to do with her. "We'll see," Garrett said finally. He set his empty coffee cup down with deliberate force and stalked out of the cookhouse, leaving an uncomfortable silence in his wake. Sarah let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding and looked around at the faces of the men who had just defended her to the boss's son. "Thank you," she said simply. "All of you." "Don't mention it, ma'am," Jake said with a grin. "Besides, anyone who can make biscuits like these has earned her place fair and square." The comment broke the tension, and the men began filing out to start their day's work, several of them stopping to thank Sarah personally for the meal. When the last man had left, Sarah found herself alone with Cole, who was standing by the window watching Garrett stride angrily across the yard. The muscle in his jaw was tight, and Sarah could see the tension radiating from his shoulders. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. "I didn't mean to cause trouble between you and Garrett." Cole turned to look at her, and Sarah was surprised by the intensity in his gray eyes. "You didn't cause anything," he said firmly. "Garrett and I have been at odds since the day I arrived. This isn't about you." But even as he said the words, Sarah suspected that wasn't entirely true. She had the feeling that her presence here had somehow escalated whatever conflict existed between the two men, and the thought made her stomach twist with worry. The last thing she wanted was to repay Cole's kindness by making his life more difficult. "What's really going on between you two?" she asked, moving closer to where he stood. "I can see there's more to this than just disagreement about hiring decisions." Cole was quiet for so long that Sarah thought he wasn't going to answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was tired and resigned. "Garrett thinks he should be running this ranch instead of his father, and he thinks I'm standing in his way." Sarah absorbed Cole's words, understanding beginning to dawn as pieces of a larger puzzle fell into place. "But you said you've been foreman for 3 years. Surely that's enough time to prove yourself." Cole's laugh was bitter and short. "You'd think so, but Garrett sees things differently. He thinks I manipulated his father into giving me the position, and he's been waiting for any excuse to get rid of me ever since." He turned away from the window and began clearing the breakfast dishes with more force than necessary. "Your being here just gives him more ammunition." "What do you mean?" Sarah asked, though she was beginning to suspect she already knew the answer. "He'll say I'm letting personal feelings cloud my judgment, that I hired you because I'm attracted to you, not because we needed a cook." Cole's cheeks flushed slightly as he said it, and Sarah felt her own face grow warm. "He'll use it to convince his father that I'm not fit to run this place." Sarah stared at him, her mind racing. "Are you attracted to me, I mean?" The question slipped out before she could stop it, and she immediately wanted to take it back. This was her employer, the man who'd saved her son's life and given her a chance when she desperately needed one. She had no business asking such personal questions. Cole went very still, his hands frozen in the act of stacking plates. For a long moment, the only sounds in the cookhouse were Thomas's contented babbling and the distant lowing of cattle. When Cole finally looked at her, his gray eyes held an honesty that took her breath away. "Yes," he said simply, "I am, but that's not why I hired you, Sarah. I hired you because you're good at what you do and because you needed the work." He paused, then added more quietly, "The fact that I find myself thinking about you more than I should is my problem, not yours." Sarah felt something flutter in her chest, a warmth that had nothing to do with the cook stove and everything to do with the way Cole was looking at her. She thought those feelings were dead, buried with David and the life they'd planned together. But standing here in the morning light, watching this strong, kind man who'd already done so much for her and Thomas, she realized that her heart was very much alive. "What if it's not just your problem?" she asked softly. "What if I've been thinking about you too?" The words hung in the air between them, loaded with possibilities and complications that neither of them had planned for. Cole took a step toward her, then stopped, his expression torn between hope and caution. "Sarah," he began, but whatever he was going to say was cut off by the sound of horses approaching at a gallop. Multiple horses, moving fast, and from the shouting that accompanied them, something was very wrong. Cole was out the door before Sarah could blink, and she followed him onto the porch with Thomas in her arms. A group of riders was thundering into the ranch yard, led by a man Sarah didn't recognize. He was older, maybe in his 60s, with silver hair and a weathered face that spoke of decades spent in the sun and wind. Even from a distance, she could see the family resemblance to Garrett in the set of his jaw and the way he sat his horse. "Cole," the man called out as he dismounted, "we've got trouble, big trouble." His voice carried the kind of authority that came naturally to some men, and Sarah realized she was looking at the owner of the Circle M Ranch, Garrett's father. "What kind of trouble, Mr. Morrison?" Cole asked, his tone immediately shifting to the professional competence Sarah had seen him display with the ranch hands. "Rustlers hit the north pasture last night," Morrison replied grimly. "Took at least 50 head, maybe more. They knew exactly where to hit and how to do it without being seen." He paused, his eyes scanning the assembled ranch hands who had gathered at the sound of commotion. This wasn't some opportunistic theft. This was planned. Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. 50 head of cattle represented a significant financial loss for any ranch, but more than that, the fact that it had been carefully planned suggested this wasn't a one-time incident. If rustlers were targeting the Circle M specifically, everyone on the ranch could be in danger. "Any tracks?" Cole asked, already moving toward the corral where his horse waited. "Some, but the ground was hard and they covered their trail well," Morrison replied. "We'll need to move fast if we want any chance of catching them." He turned to address the gathered men. "I want every available hand ready to ride in 10 minutes. We're going after these bastards." As the men scattered to prepare for the pursuit, Garrett appeared from the direction of the main house, his face dark with anger and something that might have been satisfaction. "I told you this would happen," he said to his father, his voice loud enough for everyone to hear. "I warned you that having soft leadership would make us a target." Morrison's expression hardened. "Not now, Garrett. We can discuss leadership decisions after we get our cattle back." "When?" Garrett demanded. "After they come back for more. After they realize we're too weak to protect what's ours." His gaze shifted to Cole, and Sarah saw naked hostility there. "Maybe it's time to consider putting someone in charge who actually knows how to run a ranch." Cole's jaw tightened, but he kept his voice level. "Mr. Morrison, we're wasting time. Every minute we stand here arguing is another minute those rustlers have to get away." Morrison nodded curtly. "Cole's right. Mount up, everyone. Garrett, you're with me. Cole, take half the men and circle around to the east. If they're heading for the border, we might be able to cut them off." As the men prepared to ride out, Cole turned back to Sarah, concern clear in his expression. "Lock the doors and keep your rifle close," he said quietly. "If this was planned like Morrison thinks, they might have left someone behind to cause more trouble." Sarah's blood ran cold at the implication. "How long will you be gone?" "I don't know. Could be hours, could be days, depending on how far they got." Cole hesitated, then stepped closer, lowering his voice so only she could hear. "Sarah, if something happens to me—" "Nothing's going to happen to you," Sarah interrupted firmly, though her heart was racing with sudden fear. The thought of losing Cole, especially now when they'd just begun to explore whatever was growing between them, was unbearable. "But if it does," Cole continued, ignoring her protest, "there's a strongbox in my room with enough money to get you and Thomas to San Francisco. The key's hidden behind the loose brick in the fireplace. Promise me you'll use it if you need to." Sarah stared at him, overwhelmed by the generosity and thoughtfulness of a man who was planning for her welfare even as he rode into danger. "Cole, I can't." "Promise me," he said urgently, already backing toward his horse. "Please." "I promise," Sarah whispered, though the words felt like surrender to a future she didn't want to contemplate. Cole nodded once, then swung into his saddle with the fluid grace of a man born to ride. As the group of riders thundered out of the ranch yard, Sarah caught sight of his face one last time, and what she saw there made her knees weak. It wasn't just determination or professional competence. It was the look of a man who had something worth fighting for, something worth coming back to. The silence that fell over the ranch after the men left was oppressive and strange. Sarah had grown accustomed to the constant noise and activity of 30 ranch hands going about their daily work. Now, with only herself, Thomas, and a handful of men too old or injured to ride with the pursuit party, the Circle M felt exposed and vulnerable. She spent the morning trying to keep busy, cleaning the cookhouse and preparing food for whenever the men returned. But her mind kept drifting to Cole and the dangers he might be facing. Rustlers weren't known for their mercy, especially when cornered. If shooting started, good men could die, and the thought of Cole being one of them made her stomach clench with fear. It was while she was kneading dough for the evening bread that she heard it, the sound of a single horse approaching the ranch at a steady walk. Sarah's hand stilled as she listened, her heart beginning to race. The pursuit party would return as a group, probably at a gallop if they'd been successful or a weary walk if they'd failed to catch the rustlers. A single rider moving casually could mean any number of things, and few of them were good. She wiped her hands on her apron and moved to the window, peering through the curtains at the approaching horseman. He was a stranger, tall and lean, wearing a dusty black coat and a hat pulled low over his eyes. There was something about the way he sat his horse that set off alarm bells in Sarah's mind. Too confident, too comfortable for someone who should be nervous about approaching a ranch where he wasn't expected. The stranger dismounted and tied his horse to the hitching post with casual ease, as if he belonged there. When he looked up at the cookhouse, Sarah caught a glimpse of his face and felt ice form in her veins. She'd seen enough dangerous men in her life to recognize one when she saw him, and this man was dangerous in a way that went beyond simple criminality. This was someone who enjoyed causing fear. A soft knock came at the cookhouse door, polite and patient, which somehow made it more menacing than if he tried to break it down. Sarah glanced at Thomas, sleeping peacefully in his makeshift cradle, and made a decision that could save both their lives or doom them both. "Who's there?" she called out, trying to keep her voice steady. "Just a traveler looking for a meal and maybe some information," came the reply in a voice that was smooth and cultured, completely at odds with the man's appearance. "I can pay for both." Sarah's hand moved to the rifle Cole had insisted she keep close, but she didn't pick it up yet. "The ranch hands are all out working," she said. "You'll have to come back later." A low chuckle came from the other side of the door. "Now, ma'am, I think we both know that's not true. Word is the Circle M boys rode out this morning in quite a hurry. Something about missing cattle." The voice grew closer to the door, and Sarah realized the man was probably standing right outside. "That leaves you here all alone with that baby of yours. Must be frightening." The words sent terror racing through Sarah's veins, but they also sparked something else, a fierce, protective anger that surprised her with its intensity. This man was threatening her child, and that was something she would not tolerate under any circumstances. "What do you want?" she asked, her voice growing stronger with each word. "Information, mostly. About the foreman, Cole Brennan. I understand he's been asking questions about some missing cattle, questions that might be better left unasked." Sarah's mind raced as the implications hit her. This wasn't a random traveler or even an opportunistic criminal. This was someone connected to the rustling, someone who knew about Cole's investigation and wanted to stop it, which meant Cole was in even more danger than she'd realized. Sarah's hand closed around the rifle stock as the full weight of the situation settled on her shoulders. This man knew about Cole's investigation, which meant the rustling wasn't random. It was part of something bigger, something organized enough to have people watching and reporting back. And now she and Thomas were alone with a man who had come here specifically to stop Cole from asking the wrong questions. "I don't know anything about Cole's work," Sarah said, trying to buy time while she figured out what to do. The stranger was still outside, but she could hear him moving around, probably looking for another way in. "I'm just the cook. I make meals and mind my own business." "Now, that's interesting," the stranger said, his voice moving along the side of the building. "Because the word I heard is that you're a bit more than just the cook. Word is Cole Brennan's gotten himself personally involved with a pretty widow and her baby. Makes a man vulnerable, having people he cares about." The threat in those words was unmistakable, and Sarah felt her protective instincts surge even stronger. She moved quickly to Thomas's cradle and scooped him up, holding him against her chest with one arm while she gripped the rifle with the other. If this man thought he could use her baby to get to Cole, he was about to learn how wrong he was. The sound of breaking glass came from the back room, and Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs. He was coming in whether she cooperated or not. She backed toward the front door, calculating distances and angles, trying to remember everything David had taught her about shooting. She'd never had to fire at a person before, but she wouldn't hesitate if it meant protecting Thomas. "Mrs. Whitman," the stranger called out from somewhere inside the cookhouse now, his voice echoing strangely through the rooms. "There's no need for this to be difficult. I just want to have a conversation." Sarah reached the front door and fumbled with the latch, her hands shaking as she tried to keep hold of both Thomas and the rifle. If she could get outside, maybe she could reach one of the older hands who'd stayed behind, or at least find better cover than the cookhouse offered. But the door seemed to be stuck, and precious seconds were slipping away. "Found something interesting back here," the stranger said, his voice much closer now. "Looks like our foreman's been keeping detailed notes about cattle movements and suspicious activities. Very thorough, our Mr. Brennan, almost too thorough for his own good." The door finally gave way, and Sarah stumbled out onto the porch just as the stranger appeared in the kitchen doorway behind her. In the full light of day, he looked even more dangerous than she'd imagined, tall and lean with pale eyes that held no warmth at all. He was holding a leather journal that Sarah recognized as Cole's, and seeing it in the man's hands made her feel sick with violation and fear. "That's far enough," the stranger said pleasantly, as if they were discussing the weather. "I think we should finish our conversation." Sarah turned to face him, the rifle raised and pointed at his chest. Her hands were steadier now, driven by a fierce determination to protect her child and the man she was rapidly falling in love with. "Put the journal down and get off this ranch." The stranger smiled, and the expression made Sarah's skin crawl. "You know, I was hoping you'd be reasonable about this. Saves everyone a lot of trouble." He held up the journal and waved it slightly. "See, Mr. Brennan's been documenting some activities that certain people would prefer to keep private. Nothing illegal, mind you, just business arrangements that work better when they're not subject to too much scrutiny." "What kind of business arrangements?" Sarah asked, though she was beginning to understand. The rustling hadn't been random theft. It had been organized, systematic, probably involving people who were supposed to be protecting the ranchers instead of robbing them. "The kind that involve moving cattle across certain borders without bothering with tedious paperwork," the stranger said. "The kind that require cooperation from local law enforcement and maybe even some federal officials. The kind that make everyone involved very wealthy, as long as no one asks too many questions." Sarah felt pieces clicking into place in her mind. Cole figured it out. He realized the rustling was too organized, too well-informed to be random thieves. "Smart man, your foreman, too smart for his own good." The stranger's smile faded, replaced by something cold and calculating. But intelligence can be a liability when it leads a man to stick his nose where it doesn't belong. The sound of approaching horses reached Sarah's ears, and hope flared in her chest. The pursuit party was returning, which meant Cole was coming back to her. But the stranger heard it too, and his expression grew urgent and dangerous. "Time to wrap this up," he said, reaching inside his coat. "I'm afraid Mr. Brennan's investigation ends here." Sarah saw the gun appearing in the stranger's hand and didn't hesitate. She pulled the trigger of the rifle, the recoil slamming into her shoulder and making Thomas cry out in alarm. The shot went wide, splintering wood from the porch post, but it was close enough to make the stranger dive for cover and drop Cole's journal in the process. "Sarah," Cole's voice carried across the ranch yard, filled with fear and urgency. The riders were close now, thundering toward the cookhouse at full gallop. The stranger cursed viciously and fired a shot toward the approaching men before sprinting toward his horse. Sarah crouched behind the porch railing, clutching Thomas and trying to reload the rifle with shaking hands. The stranger was mounting his horse now, and she could see Cole bearing down on him with several other riders. But the man was fast, and he had a head start toward the open range. Cole reached the cookhouse first, throwing himself from his horse before it had fully stopped and rushing toward Sarah with an expression of such raw fear and relief that it took her breath away. "Are you hurt? Is Thomas all right?" "We're fine," Sarah gasped, allowing herself to collapse into Cole's arms as the reality of what had just happened hit her. "He wanted your journal, the one with your notes about the cattle. Cole, I think the rustling is bigger than just theft. I think there are officials involved, people in law enforcement maybe." Cole's arms tightened around her and Thomas, and Sarah could feel the fine tremor in his muscles that spoke of barely controlled emotion. "I know," he said quietly. "We caught 2 of the rustlers, and they talked. This operation involves people all the way up to the territorial government. Someone's been using their position to facilitate cattle theft on a massive scale." Morrison and the other riders had reached the cookhouse now, and Sarah could see the grim satisfaction on the older man's face. "Did we get the bastard who threatened Mrs. Whitman?" "He got away," Cole said, his voice tight with frustration. "But we know who sent him now, and we have enough evidence to bring down the whole operation." He looked down at Sarah, his gray eyes intense with emotion. "I'm sorry, Sarah. I never should have left you alone when I knew how dangerous this was getting." "You couldn't have known," Sarah said firmly, reaching up to touch his face. "And I wasn't alone. I had Thomas to protect, and that gave me all the strength I needed." Cole caught her hand and pressed it against his cheek, his eyes closing briefly as if he were savoring the contact. When he opened them again, Sarah saw something there that made her heart skip, not just relief or gratitude, but love. Real, deep, complicated love that acknowledged all the pain they'd both endured and chose to hope anyway. "Sarah," Cole began, but Morrison cleared his throat pointedly. "Much as I hate to interrupt," the older man said with a slight smile, "we've got some cleanup to do. Garrett's going to be mighty disappointed when he finds out his contact in the territorial marshal's office was the one feeding information to the rustlers." Sarah looked between Cole and Morrison, understanding dawning. Garrett was involved. "Not directly," Cole said, "but he was so eager to discredit me that he started sharing information with people he thought would help him prove I was incompetent. He had no idea he was actually helping the rustlers plan their raids." Morrison's expression grew serious. "Garrett's young and stupid, but he's not malicious. He'll learn from this, or he'll find himself working someone else's ranch." He turned to Cole with something that might have been approval. "You did good work, Cole, both with the investigation and with protecting what matters." As the other men began securing the scene and collecting evidence, Cole drew Sarah aside, his hands gentle on her shoulders. "I need to tell you something," he said quietly. "When I was riding back here and heard that gunshot, when I thought something might have happened to you and Thomas, I realized that I can't keep pretending my feelings for you are just attraction or gratitude." Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs as she looked up into his face. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying I love you," Cole said simply. "I love you and I love Thomas, and I want to build a life with both of you if you'll have me. I know it's fast, and I know you're still grieving your husband, but—" Sarah silenced him by rising on her toes and pressing her lips to his, pouring all of her own love and hope and gratitude into the kiss. When they finally broke apart, both breathless, she rested her forehead against his and smiled through the tears that were streaming down her face. "I love you too," she whispered. "I didn't think I could ever feel this way again, but you saved more than just Thomas's life, Cole. You saved mine too." Cole's arms came around her again, and as Thomas gurgled happily between them, Sarah felt something she hadn't experienced since David died, the sense of being part of a family again. Not a replacement for what she'd lost, but something new and precious and worth fighting for. "So what happens now?" Sarah asked, looking around at the ranch that had become her home and sanctuary. Cole followed her gaze, his expression thoughtful. Now we rebuild. Morrison's offered to make me a partner in the ranch, and with the rustling operation shut down, we'll be able to focus on making the Circle M the best spread in the territory. He looked down at her with eyes full of love and promise. And if you'll marry me, we'll do it together. Sarah laughed, surprising herself with the sound of pure joy. Are you proposing to me in the middle of a crime scene, Cole Brennan? I'm proposing to you wherever you'll say yes, Cole replied seriously. Crime scene, church, middle of a cattle drive, I don't care where as long as you say yes. Sarah looked around at the ranch hands who were grinning openly at the romantic drama unfolding before them, at Morrison, who was pretending not to listen while clearly enjoying every word, and at Thomas, who was reaching tiny hands toward the man who had already become his father in every way that mattered. Yes, she said firmly, loudly enough for everyone to hear. Yes, I'll marry you, Cole Brennan. The cheer that went up from the assembled men could probably be heard in the next county, and as Cole spun her around in a circle, Thomas laughing with delight in her arms, Sarah felt the last pieces of her broken heart finally heal. She'd come to the Circle M as a desperate widow with a dying baby and nothing left to lose. She was staying as a woman who had found love, family, and a future worth believing in. Sometimes, Sarah thought as Cole kissed her again while the sun set behind the mountains, the best destinations were the ones you never planned to reach.